Well, hello YouTube, it's me, Fortmaster, and welcome back to another Super Eyepatch Wolf reaction. And, God, yeah, this is how Jake Paul beat Mike Tyson. You know, I'm gonna be completely honest. Like, any day, like, that I don't hear anything about either of the Pauls or KSI or Mr. Beast is a good day in my book. I am personally so tired about constantly hearing about them. And then there was this whole debacle with Jake Paul fighting Mike Tyson, which, quite honestly, I so hoped he would lose, but then he didn't. And then, and then I heard all this stuff about, like, Mike Tyson. Well, of course, you know, he's in his 60s. And then he was apparently just out of surgery as well, which this entire thing just left a giant bad taste in my mouth. I'm going to be completely honest, I'm kind of watching this with a bit of trepidation, this video I mean, because while personally I would quite like to just leave that whole thing with the Pauls and just try to like mute them out of my life as much as possible, I do like Super Eyepatch Wolf's videos and, you know, his thought process and the way he talks about stuff. So yeah, very much the end of this video is going to have my true feelings on this whole video. That was a very redundant sentence. Simply because I'm at the topic of the video and the person making the video are like at the very diametric ends of my interest here. So yeah, we should probably get this thing started then at the very least. So yeah, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video will lead to my Let's Play of the day. And yeah, with all that out of the way, let's get this thing started then, shall we?
What you're looking at is a boxing match that took place at the 1981 Junior Olympics, in which a young Mike Tyson takes on Joe Cortez, an experienced boxer with 13 wins. But those wins won't matter. The bell rings and Tyson's opponent is immediately trapped in a maelstrom of fists, Tyson bashing the consciousness out of his opponent in a mere 8 seconds. A chilling prophecy in what was to become one of the most terrifying and dominant champions in combat sports, and particularly when you consider Tyson was just 15 years old when this footage was taken.
What? Really? Okay, I mean, I know he was a good boxer, but God, that is scary. Again, so another thing I should probably mention, I'm not really into boxing, like wrestling, boxing. I'm not really into combat sports, as Wolf put it. I'm watching this purely because I like Super Eyepatch Wolf's videos.
This is Jake Paul when he was 15.
Go, come on, we have to go, come on.
Somehow, on the night of November...
And you know, somehow, still less insufferable than modern Jake Paul.
19th, 2024, these two people would meet as social media thing Jake Paul would face former world heavyweight champion Mike Tyson in a boxing match, with many salivating at the thought that Paul was about to receive his brutal penance for his sins against the world of boxing, only for those same fans to watch in horror as, over the course of 8 rounds, the once considered baddest man on the planet was picked apart by a person of whom major life milestones include being fired from the Disney Channel. But where things grew even stranger was the aftermath. Slowed down footage revealed what looked like Tyson pulling his punches. Strange moments where you can see Paul drop his guard and chastise Tyson for hitting him too hard. And most damning of all, a script leaked days before the fight that read eerily close to the fight's outcome. For many, what was happening was obvious. This fight was fixed.
Or maybe Mike Tyson is just really old and Jake Paul it isn't.
Wolf, don't ruin this for me. I have my fantasies of seeing Jake Paul just in a bloody heap on the ground, like clawing at just with like death, like just on the verge of death. Don't ruin this for me.
Okay, well, that's the video. Bye.
Yeah, of course.
Okay, I think what's happening here is that when people look at this fight, they know that something is wrong, but misunderstand what that thing actually is. And that misunderstanding has led to what I call the Jake Paul cycle. Jake Paul fights a legitimate fighter, beats them, people say it was fixed, but then those same people get excited about the prospect of Jake Paul's next opponent, murdering him, only for Paul to win that fight. People say it was fixed, and on and on and on and on. It's a cycle that's repeated 9 times now, and one that's seen Paul defeat multiple mixed martial arts world champions as well as professional boxers. I do think there is a lot of people who can see what's happening here, but I think there's significantly more that can't, and those are the people I want to make this video for. I posted a thread about this on Blue Sky and was genuinely shocked at the amount of people who had no idea what Jake Paul was doing in these fights. By the way, I'm on Blue Sky because that's what social media is now. Not about which platform you like the best, but which makes you want to die the least. See, fighting is something I care about a lot. I fight multiple times a week and have done for many years, and while I'm not particularly good at it, I love it. And so when I see a public spectacle that is so specifically designed to communicate a false narrative, not only about Jake Paul's abilities as a fighter, but the very nature of what fighting is, I'm gonna talk about it. And particularly in light of Paul's recent 3-part documentary, Countdown. Although calling this a documentary is like calling an episode of Courage the Cowardly Dog 4 years in veterinary college.
You know, I'm just going to say this now. That one tidbit is a point against the video, because I was quite happy not knowing that such a documentary existed.
Starting by asking why athletes like Mike Tyson and Jake Paul fight, before coming to the conclusion that Paul is just built different. And I think that's a bunch of bollocks. An illusion I shall dismantle in this video. And Jake, if you see this and have a problem with it, I'm laying it down right now. I would fucking kill you. At Capcom vs SNK 2 for the PlayStation 2, because the GameCube version has the easy operation controls, which ruins the character balance.
You might think me decimating Jake Paul at a quarter-of-a-century-old fighting game is an ineffective way to delegitimize him as a fighter, but as we shall see, obliterating someone in an area they are not equipped to compete in is a central part of the dog and pony show that is Jake Paul's fighting career. Paul has dubbed himself the future of boxing and inevitable world champion, comparing himself to the likes of Muhammad Ali and Mike Tyson, but claiming he will never receive the credit he deserves because people hate him, which begs the entire question the Jake Paul cycle hinges upon. Is Jake Paul a good boxer? Well, the distortion of that answer began on the night of April 17th, 2021. After emerging victorious in a series of fights where he knocked out a YouTuber, and a basketball player, a mild Twitter beef led to Paul facing his first legitimate opponent, Ben Askren. In terms of raw toughness, you only need to look at a photo of Ben Askren to know what he is. Ears like
he's
this
a fighter.
do not result from a gentle life. This is a man who once finished a season with 87 straight wins and 0 losses. A fighter who would go on to become the welterweight champion of both Bellator and won championships.
But I can't help but notice that, you know, all of these fighting clips that we're seeing aren't of boxing. They're of mixed martial arts. Okay, I'm beginning to see the thesis of this video. Okay.
Before being traded to the UFC, where he would compete with the best in the world. But even more so than being a formidable fighter, what made Askren the perfect opponent for Paul was that he was likable. There's a humility to Askren that makes him endearing, as was first seen when, after suffering a heartbreaking elimination from the 2008 Olympics, Askren was asked if fighting under a different rule set hampered his chances at victory. And he just responded, "I wasn't good enough. I sucked. before walking away in silence. That's who Askren was, never trying to put on a front or persona, but just genuinely himself, even to the detriment of his career, later dedicating his time to coaching children in grappling. It's that earnestness that added to the narrative of this fight. The lifelong humble martial artist versus an arrogant influencer who is better known for faking marriages than fighting. And you could see that dynamic play.
You know, I'm not going to even ask. No.
Out in these interviews.
Hey, it's
What do
your
you think
dad
it is
calling
about
in.
your stuff that's made it successful?
It's your dad calling in. Look,
Is he still alive?
he's still alive, bro. I'm about to take him out.
Flip-flop, man.
Hey, he's still alive. Don't worry, I'm gonna finish him off. That's my guy Masvidal, maker of Ben Askren. Jake Paul will be the finisher of Ben Askren.
The difference between Paul and Askren was never more clear than in their entrances. Paul emerging through smoke, accompanied by a giant dancing robot, and Askren with a single cardboard sign that just read, "This is Ben." As they stared at each other from across the ring, many were gleeful at the prospect of watching Paul's destruction at the hands of Askren. But what happened was very different.
With former world champion Jean Pascal and also cruiserweight contender.
Ben Askren was KO'd in the first round. So, what happened here? Well, remember when I mentioned that 87 match undefeated win streak from Askren? What I failed to mention is that those matches were all in wrestling. Wrestling is the art of grappling
yeah, okay,
and
there we
pinning
go.
an opponent, and a foundational part of any mixed martial artist's arsenal. Wrestling is, in MMA, the great neutralizer, both a means to smother the punches and kicks of strikers, while also keeping you from drowning against the ground-based submissions of jiu-jitsu. And Askren is one of the most accomplished and dangerous wrestlers on the planet. However, asking Ben Askren to compete in a boxing match is like using a time machine to ask Leonardo da Vinci to write you some Gojo X Gato fan fiction. The results will be interesting, but messy, and that's what this fight was. Askren, broken down from a career of cage fights and recovering from hip surgery, looked far from fighting shape and was dominated by Paul for the entire 1 minute and 59 seconds that this fight lasted. Immediately in its aftermath, you started to hear the murmurs of a rigged fight, many claiming if Jake Paul faced a real legitimate striker and not a grappler, he'd be destroyed.
I mean, honestly, how can you say that wasn't rigged, like, at all? Like, he wasn't even, it wasn't a fair fight in the slightest. I'm just gonna say it, with all, like, and it's not just with, like, Jake Paul, but all of these, like, YouTuber boxing matches and stuff like this, I have, like, no want to see them at all. Like, the most I've seen of them is like when people share clips of them on Twitter or something like that. And honestly, this whole thing, it's making me feel like the exact same thing that was going on when Velma was on, and that it was a show that everybody knew was going to be bad, and the message had to go out: don't hate watch it, because if you hate watch it, you're just helping them.
And Paul's team, smelling opportunity, lined up his next fight, Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley is a UFC legend, holding the welterweight title for nearly 3 years and beloved by MMA fans for his conscious, obliterating knockouts. Woodley was someone with real, proven destructive power in his fists, and while Askren was likable, Woodley felt cold and dangerous, an assassin who was going to slit the throat of Paul's fighting career. At least, that's how it seems. However, dive a little deeper into Woodley, and we start to notice some unusual patterns. Like Askren, Woodley's background actually wasn't striking, but wrestling. And while he developed explosive knockout power later in his career, he had no actual background in boxing. And what's more, those devastating KOs, they came between the years of 2010 and 2016. The fight with
Several
Jake
years
Paul
ago.
taking place in 2021. And in the 5 years since his glory days, Woodley had suffered a massive decline, ending his UFC career on a 4-fight losing streak and being mauled by practically every opponent in the process. And so now, pushing 40, this is the Woodley Paul would face. And while the initial bout was more competitive than the Askren fight, Paul winning by decision, in a rematch, Woodley was brutally banished to the land of wind and ghosts by...
I swear, if I didn't hate Jake Paul before, this would certainly make me hate him.
An overhead right. This is where the Jake Paul cycle really kicked into effect, and particularly when fans isolated a moment where it looks like Jake Paul sends a hand signal to Woodley before knocking him out. If you don't know that this is a feint, then that means you haven't watched Hajime no Ippo, even though I asked you to 8 years ago. Again, fans cry for blood, and again, an arguably even more credible opponent steps forward, Nate Diaz. While Diaz wasn't as decorated as Woodley, he was, in his own right, terrifying. Here's how I describe Nate Diaz. His brother Nick at one point continued a fight with an opponent in the emergency room, and Nick was considered the more sensible of the two. There was no way someone like Diaz would throw a fight for money, and particularly not against someone like Paul. And then Paul won by decision. Rigged, outrage, the Spider, Anderson Silva, a man who dominated the UFC's middleweight division with an apocalyptic 7-year title reign, one of the most precise and devastating strikers in MMA, and a popular candidate for greatest of all time, who somehow also suffered a decision loss to Paul and even a legitimate knockdown in the 8th round. To people who don't have a lot of experience fighting, I understand how this looks, as it seems there's only 2 possible explanations. 1, Paul is as good as he says he is, or 2, these fights are scripted. And not wanting to accept that first option, most people will choose the second. But this is the problem with the Jake Paul cycle. When you complain these fights are scripted, then the validity of them hinges on whether Paul's opponents are taking dives or not. And I think the chances that 4 of the most legitimate MMA fighters on the planet all being willing to take paid legacy tarnishing dives, especially Nate Diaz, who, I remind you, has the temperament of a volcano made of fists, is extremely unlikely. So then, how in the name of God does this fucking clown legitimately beat some of the most dangerous men on the planet in fights? Well, the answer is he didn't. He beat them in boxing matches. If you're unfamiliar with fighting...
Exactly! Literally what I said before!
That might sound like a subtle and possibly meaningless distinction. A fight is a fight, right? Well, no. Your average MMA fighter is trained in 5 disciplines: punches, kicks, wrestling, ground grappling, and I'd argue that the crossover between those systems, as well as various other miscellaneous situational fighting arts like Muay Thai clinches or ground and pounds, as a 5th. Most MMA fighters will likely be an expert in one of these systems, but in order to just survive at a high level, you need a grounding in all. Even if a talented striker has no interest in submitting their opponent, they need to know enough grappling to at least defend takedowns. And likewise, an expert submission artist will need to know enough striking to weather enough punches and kicks to allow them to get close to their opponents. What that means is that in a boxing match, MMA fighters are losing 80% of their tools, whereas a boxer still has 100% of their trained skill set. Think of it like this. A mage is only a good class in an RPG as long as they have the ability to cast spells. Take those spells away, and even a massively
literally
overleveled
useless.
mage becomes a walking target. And when you have a boxer, what you have is someone who has put all their experience points, i.e. all their time, energy, and resources, into boxing. So when you pair an MMA fighter with a boxer in a boxing match, it's such a freakish mismatch because so much of what an MMA fighter has put their own experience into is meaningless under a boxing rule set. And while I do not admire it, I at least have to credit Jake Paul and his team for being perceptive enough to recognize this exploit, as it's something both MMA fans and fighters were blindsided by. So when using these fights as a basis to ask, is Jake Paul a good boxer? It's fair to say, yeah, Jake Paul is a great boxer by normal person standards. He'd definitely beat me, he would probably beat you, and he would likely beat everyone you know. But that statement also carries the same uncomfortable caveat as crediting Mark Zuckerberg for placing in jiu-jitsu competitions. Sure, that's impressive, and I say that as someone who has had their face broken in martial arts tournaments, but Zuckerberg has the wealth to hire the literal best coaches, trainers, and sports scientists on the planet, and is free to dedicate as much of his time as he wants to that world-class level of training atop his floating dojo boat. So when he taps out a Whataburger employee,
Again, the rich are so weird.
who crams 2 jiu-jitsu classes a week in between soul-grinding physical labor and taking care of his family, forgive me if I do not stand in applause. The same is true of Jake Paul. How many other amateur boxers do you think have a stem cell reviving light bed that they use to recover from training? All that to say, these men are not succeeding under the same circumstances as everyone else. But that aside, sure, Jake Paul is a good boxer by normal person standards, but what that statement lacks is context. I consider myself pretty okay by normal person standards at jiu-jitsu. Something I measure by the fact that I've been doing it for 5 years, and when a new person joins, even if they are much bigger than me, which they frequently are, as I stand at a delicate 5'7.5", I can usually submit them in about a minute. And I'm sure for the length of that match, it would seem to the average white belt that I possess a high level of jiu-jitsu. However, put me against anyone who takes jiu-jitsu even slightly more serious than a hobby, and my utterly mediocre grappling will be exposed for what it is. And that is all to say, a victory, even a dominant one, says nothing about a fighter's actual skill level when separated from context. So, by an average person's standards, is Jake Paul a good boxer? Sure. But when measured by a professional standard compared to professional boxers, well, this was a criticism that began to haunt Paul, and one he sought to address through a series of 3 fights, in which he faced professional boxer Andre August, who held a record of 10 wins and 1 loss, professional boxer Ryan Borland, who held a record of 17 wins and 2 losses, and Platinum Mike Perry, a bare-knuckle boxer on a 5-match win streak and holder of the symbolic King of Violence title. Paul won all these matches by knockout, and there you have it. Indisputable proof that Jake Paul is a legitimate boxer. Wait a minute. When determining the caliber of a fighter...
Yeah, okay. Again, I'm going to be completely honest here. Like, I love Eyepatch Wolf's videos, and right now I am feeling very uneasy from watching this. Partially because it just occurred to me that I'm kind of now actually stressing a little bit that my reaction to this might get taken down like my reactions to his WrestleMania videos. But also, too, it's just... all of this with Jake Paul, it is infuriating. It is honestly infuriating. Just seemingly, and I'm fairly certain, Wolf will go into details why these last 3 fights were, again, not entirely genuine. All of his previous matches up to this point in the video have been, mixed martial artists who have, not been able to use their entire, tool sets, or have just been, past their prime, or, with Mike Tyson, was quite literally 60 years old. In most places, he is literally a senior citizen. But it's just, I swear, this whole thing, Jake Paul quite literally has an extremely punchable face.
Less important is how many people they've beaten, and more important is the caliber of opponents they've beaten. That's the metric we've applied to Paul so far, but what happens when we apply that metric to Paul's opponents? Well, Andre August does have a 10-1 record. What that doesn't tell you is the quality of opponents August got that record against. So here are the win-loss records of everyone Andre August had defeated. 0 wins and 1 loss. 3 wins and 13 losses. 1 win and 5 losses. 0 wins and 8 losses. 7 wins and 16 losses. 6 wins and 29 losses. Mate, just stop fighting.
I swear, we're getting into some real Glass Joe territory here.
5 wins and 18 losses. 7 wins and 14 losses. 0 wins and 1 loss. 4 wins and 7 losses. The average win-loss of Andre August defeated opponents is 3 wins and 11 losses. In other words, August himself was not fighting world-class opponents, making his 10-1 record by professional standards, well, much less impressive. But then what about Ryan Borland? Well, if we run the same average opponent win-loss, it comes out at 7 wins and 9 losses, which, while better than August, by professional standards, is still not that impressive. To give that a little more context, both Andre and Borland are aggregated at half a star and 1 star out of 5 on the BoxRec database, so not even close to world-class standard. And yet, there is an even deeper, more insidious layer to this illusion. When you picture a boxer with a 17-2 record like Borland, you probably picture someone like this, and you would be correct. This is Ryan Borland in 2018, but the fight with Jake Paul took place in 2024, and Borland now looks like this. Borland had fought only 1 fight in the last 6 years. Andre only 1 fight in the last 4, and both are 9 years older than Paul and basically retired, which is a pattern we can also see in his matches versus MMA fighters. The average age difference between Paul and those fighters being 13 years. Anderson Silva was 47 years old. And this is what Paul does. He selects old, broken down fighters whose bodies have been torn apart from a lifetime of injuries from competitive fighting, and then humiliates them. And so, along those lines, I have some suggestions for Paul's next opponents. My Neighbor Miss O'Reilly, a dinosaur skeleton, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and finally, Gandalf the Wizard, who is both old and not real, which
I mean, but he was, you know, the Middle Earth's equivalent to an angel, so Paul might actually lose that fight.
Should make things really convenient. Okay, but then how do you possibly explain the victory over Platinum Mike Perry, 33 years old and on a 5-fight win streak, now dubbed the King of Violence? Well, here's the thing about bare knuckle. It is very, very dangerous, as was tragically proven with the death of Justin Thornton, who died from injuries following a bare knuckle fight. Which means in the brief 5 years bare knuckle's been running, it has more deaths than the UFC, whose current fatalities sit at 0, despite the fact that the UFC has been around for several more decades and held infinitely more fights. In other words, it's just not that high caliber of boxer willing to take unprotected shots to the head for comparatively less pay than either the UFC or boxing. And while I try not to make a habit of insulting entire sports of men who can cave in my delicate facial features like a child puncturing an Easter egg, I think Perry's record bears this out. His 5-fight bare knuckle win streak coming not against boxers, but an ex-MMA fighter, an ex-MMA fighter, an ex-MMA fighter, an ex-MMA fighter, and an ex-MMA fighter.
So it was basically Jake Paul versus another Jake Paul. Okay.
Perry himself not having a background in professional boxing, but MMA. You have to marvel at the sheer cowardly precision in Jake Paul's opponent selection, targeting vulnerable fighters who, on paper, to the public, seem threatening, but in actuality, against someone with Paul's wealth, time, youth, and resources, don't stand any chance at all. These opponents prove basically nothing about Paul's acumen as a professional boxer. So what happens then when Paul does go up against a credible boxer his own age? Well, if you were to believe the Countdown documentary, this.
But in February of 2023, he took on an established boxer for the first time in his career, Tyson Fury's younger brother, Tommy Fury. And even though he knocked down Fury in the last round of the bout, Jake took his first loss in a split decision.
Despite Countdown being a documentary about Jake Paul being a boxer, that 15-second clip is all the time Countdown gives to the one instance of Jake Paul fighting an
actual boxer
his own age, and laughably attempts to frame it as some hard-fought battle that Paul was robbed of. But if you watch the actual fight, what you get is 8 rounds of Paul being dog-walked by Fury. At no point does he look competitive or even competent, to the point that Paul's team walked out on him after this fight. And as for that knockdown in the 8th, I'll let this slow-motion footage help you decide if this was a legitimate knockdown or an ill-timed slip. And as for that one judge that ruled in Paul's favor, all that proves to me is that there was a serious concussion suffered that night. It
wasn't by the boxer.
And the thing is, Tommy Fury was not even considered an especially good boxer at this point. Only after this fight was he even ranked in his own weight division, and that rank was 39. So to answer, is Jake Paul a good professional boxer? Well, he's had one fight against an active, unranked boxer and lost decisively. So no, he isn't. From here, Paul attempted to claw back legitimacy with his matches against August, Borland, and Perry, but these matches failed to generate a fraction of the hype his previous bouts had. And so, if Paul was going to reinsert himself into the world of boxing, he'd need to create a bigger spectacle than he ever had. He'd need an opponent who, in the eyes of the public, was more dangerous than anything Paul had faced. An opponent whose legacy was inseparable from the world of boxing. But simultaneously, an opponent who stood no real chance against him. That was the target Paul needed, and he found it. Mike Tyson could not have lived a more different life than Paul. His early years were riddled with conviction, abuse, and poverty, until his entry into the world of boxing saw him in 5 short years capture the heavyweight championship and become one of the most dominant and generation-defining athletes in existence, alongside Space Jam's Michael Jordan. Watching Pioneer Tyson is terrifying. It's like watching a superior kind of human inflicted upon mere mortals, a pugilistic deity whose fists are conduit for malice and oblivion. That's the aura that formed around Tyson's undisputed 3-year title reign. Each of Tyson's apocalyptic knockouts a brushstroke in the portrait of a man whose fury and power could only be dulled so much by age. Or at least, that's how it seemed to people. One of the things that really surprised me about the lead to Tyson versus Paul was how many fight experts judged the bout hard to predict. But I think that's the legacy Tyson's matches created. A boxing deity not vulnerable to the same ravages of time as the rest of us. But to me, when Paul versus Tyson was announced, it was a very different Tyson match that came to mind. Kevin McBride is an Irish journeyman boxer and someone who was to many the perfect stepping stone for Tyson to make his big comeback, following years away from boxing. However, what happened that night was far from anything anyone was expecting. People envisioned an early Tyson KO, but it never came. McBride pushing Tyson till the once legendary fighter looks exhausted and broken. At the beginning of the 7th round, Tyson refuses to leave his corner, and the match is called a forfeit, in a loss that shocked the world. And just listen to how he speaks about boxing in this post-fight interview.
Mike, first let's start with you. Did you want to continue?
Well, I would like to continue, but I saw that I was getting beat on. I realized I don't think I have it anymore because I got the ability to stay in shape, but I don't got the fighting guts, I don't think, anymore. I just don't have this in my heart anymore.
Did you feel as though you had it coming into the fight?
No, I'm just fighting to take care of my bills, basically.
This was not Mike Tyson, the Phenom, anymore. This was a Mike Tyson whose body and spirit had been eroded by 2 decades at the peak of what was at the time the most crushing combat sport in the world. It was a Mike Tyson who'd struggled with addiction. A Mike Tyson who, after a legacy-tarnishing sexual assault conviction, had spent 4 years in jail and was now a muffled echo of the fighter he used to be. That was the person who fought McBride that night, but that night was 20 years ago. At 58, Tyson was a whisper of the fighter he used to be. He now uses a walking stick. He now spends more time podcasting than he does fighting. A Mike Tyson who had to cancel the initial bout due to a stomach ulcer, and this is the man who was sold to the public as a legitimate challenger to Paul. After a spirited first round, every second of Tyson's 40 years of damage can be seen etched into his movements. Exhausted, he chases Paul around the ring. In the 6th round, he throws just 7 punches. The fight ending in a unanimous landslide decision for Paul. The same accusations of a fixed fight flood the internet, with people whom I'm guessing have no experience boxing interpreting moments like Mike Tyson not falling for obvious bait as proof of collusion.
But again, that's just the thing. These fights are rigged. Honestly, just the more I hear about this, the more this is making me, like, actually queasy. God, I swear, at this point, you would not be able to pay me to be in the same room as Jake Paul.
Then there's the script. But the only thing the script actually got right was the first round, which was just how Tyson always fights versus how Paul always fights. And it actually got the ending wrong, calling a Paul KO victory in round 5, but I guess people didn't read that far. The complaints of a fixed fight are so intense that an official statement is released declaring the fight not scripted, and in doing so, perfectly priming the Jake Paul cycle to start all over again. But the thing is, if you know how the Jake Paul cycle works, this fight was easy to predict, as it's the same manipulation of public perception we've been talking about this entire video. And I can say that because I did predict it months before it happened on stream.
What Jake Paul does is he just challenges old retired fighters who are like either not trained in boxing or have been not boxing for years, and then just beats the shit out of them because he's young and strong. I called all this out because, not because I like Jake Paul, but because I don't. And so that when he beats Tyson on points, I can point to this and be like, that's the trick? It's the same trick every time. And every time people are like, oh, Anderson Silva's gonna beat the shit out of Jake Paul. Nate Diaz is gonna be, like, every time it's the same trick.
I think there's 2 reasons people so badly want to believe that this fight was fixed. And the first is simple. People don't like Jake Paul. But the second
he's quite honestly like a horrible and unlikable human being.
As I mentioned, one of the things I really struggled to understand in making this video is how so many people judge the fight as hard to predict, when to me, there was only ever going to be one outcome, and I don't know that much about boxing. And I think a part of that was Tyson's aura and the impact he'd had on the sport, but I think there's also a deeper reason. Watching a decrepit, aged Mike Tyson lose a boxing match to a social media influencer is about as devastating a statement you can make on the effect age has on our mortal frames. The most brutal reinforcement possible that the ultimate, unbeatable, and undisputed opponent we must all face one day is time. And that's not just hard to accept, it's devastating. And a big reason why I think so many people would rather engage in conspiracy. But sometimes there is no conspiracy. Sometimes things are just the way they are, and it sucks. With all this in mind, I want to go back to the idea of giving Jake Paul credit. I understand that there's a temptation to look at everything Paul's done and say, you gotta give the guy some credit, but I think that very much depends. Paul has affected the world of boxing, and in some inarguably positive ways, like the promotion of Katie Taylor and Amanda Serrano, two of the best boxers in the world who, under Paul's promotion, have received the paydays and attention that they both deserve. And if Paul truly wants to make a real positive impact in boxing, I think it's going to be in lifting up fighters like this. But I do wonder if he'll be willing to do the same for talented young male fighters in his weight division. But for now, as a promoter, sure, I give Jake Paul credit. But as a boxer, well, here's the difference between someone like Jake Paul and Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali also talked shit. Muhammad Ali also made it so that people wanted to see him lose. But the major difference is that Muhammad Ali was routinely defeating the best fighters on the planet. He was backing up every syllable of boxing with some of the most blazing skill the world had ever seen. That's what made it real, and that's what makes it last. Paul, on the other hand, well, I'm going to borrow the sentiments of fellow Irish violence enthusiast Napoleon Bonaparte. I will give Jake Paul credit when he beats an active ranked boxer his own age on a win streak. And so, with that in mind, I want to ask one final question. If you can't give Paul credit as a fighter, then what kind of fighter should you give credit to?
A good one?
Imagine the kind of fighter you have to be to weigh just 122 pounds and still become known as the monster. That's what Naoya Inoue is. At 28 fights, 28 wins, and 25 knockouts, Inoue is terrifying. Watch replays of his knockouts, and it's like he's not even affected by the slow motion. But his opponent is, as they sluggishly flail against a vicious blizzard of fists, a demonic speed that allows Inoue to reach across the ring in a fraction of a second and shatter a boxer's consciousness. Inoue will often toy with his opponents, like he's mocking the gap that exists between him and the rest of the world. That inhuman ability resulting in Inoue depleting his entire global weight division, collecting the lineal WBA, WBC, and IBF titles, unifying them into a single undisputed championship, and doing so in such dominant fashion that there was no one left to fight, before he ascended an entire weight division and did the exact same thing again. Compared to him, Paul's achievements as a fighter are laughable, and I don't think that's a fair comparison, but those are the credentials Paul himself is asking to be judged by. However, there is also another answer to the kind of fighter that deserves credit. Amy Scully is a young Irish MMA fighter who works part-time as a painter-decorator, and yet still trains her ass off to the point that she recently became the two-time IMMAFT World Champion. And she did so with a fraction of the resources Jake Paul has. That is fucking amazing. To me, someone who works a 9 to 5 or 9 to 6 or 8 to 7 and still finds the time and spirit to train and compete, that deserves credit. And for the record, I do not count myself in that. I too am guilty of the cushy, self-determinant life of a YouTuber, but I've fought train engineers who show up to 7 a.m. training after an all-night shift, skin still tinged with engine oil, and still battle like goddamn warriors. Jake Paul isn't built different, he just has more resources. And honestly, I'm not even that concerned with the effect he'll have on boxing, but I do care about fighting, and I do care about how it's perceived. Because I really, truly believe that fighting is for everyone. It's a way to push your limits and get to know yourself in a way you never otherwise would. And if you come away from this video with anything, I really, truly hope that it's that you consider giving fighting a shot yourself, whether it's grappling, boxing, or everything. Because when ordinary people do that, well, that's a lot more impressive to me than whatever Jake Paul is pretending to do. Oh, by the way.
This video is sponsored by...
Oh, the sponsorship, okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's the
I completely forgot about the sponsorships, yeah.
In the house tonight, cheering me on are some of the biggest celebrities in Angel City, like the one responsible for exposing Crow as the fraud she is. It's Damage! And the other members of the Kings of Violence.
Does she ever stop talking?
Oh my god, she said my name! Kinda! And of course, savior to Angel City, CEO of Zero Day Industries, and my beloved boss. Huh? I can't believe it's him! Zero! Are
Okay.
you ready to once and for all see this bitch humiliated? I hope someone either brought a stretcher or a body bag, because those are the only ways she's leaving this arena.
You ever hear that expression? Wolves don't lose sleep over the opinions of sheep.
I'm gonna enjoy this.
Just want to give a little shout out to Gabrielle over at Kylemore JSBJJ. If you're in Dublin and want to learn to grapple, I could not recommend them enough. Also, if you'd like to dive deeper into the complex legacy of Mike Tyson, I'm going to recommend FT Signifier's video on him. It is fantastic. Friends, thank you for joining me today. Remember to check out the new Eyepatch Wolf.
I know anybody who's actually able to make a living off of YouTube has it easy compared to, you know, the vast majority of, you know, people. And at the same time, I know it might be a little rich coming from me, you know, the ultra small time reaction and let's play YouTuber, but there's just something about watching like Jake Paul and, you know, all of the other YouTubers of, I don't want to say caliber, like, you know, similar brand, similar image, similar personality and stuff like that, where they're just, like, their entire thing is just seemingly, like, being unlikable and, like, showing off. Like, hey, look what I have, ha ha ha. I mean, I grew up with YouTubers like, well, specifically like Markiplier, like watching the Yogs cast, Dan TDM, and, you know, that whole thing about what he tweeted out like a while ago about what happened with YouTubers when KSI was promoting their lunch leap thing. It honestly hurts me seeing that, like, I mean, just going back, like, I miss older YouTube when, you know, the most popular YouTubers were just people. They just did things for fun. And now you have this whole subculture of quasi-celebrity status. I mean, yes, I mean, call it jealousy if you want. But it's just, like, why did these losers have to be the ones that have all the money? Yeah. God, so yeah, that's definitely going to be it for now. So, yeah, of course, as always, original videos linked in the description if you haven't seen it yet for some reason. Corner video link to my Let's Play of the day. And yeah, with all that out of the way, I hope you guys liked. If you did, leave a like, subscribe if not, and I'll see you guys next time. Goodbye.